Hi everyone, and welcome to this summer creative retreat. I'm Malka Klein, and I'm an artist and calligrapher from Israel. You can find me on Instagram by that name, Malka Klein. Today I'm going to be teaching you a short introduction to Hebrew calligraphy, and I'm super excited about it. Not only because this is a beautiful initiative of bringing people together to learn for free, but also because Hebrew calligraphy specifically, it's hard to find material online on this craft, despite the fact that it's a language and an art that has been around for literally thousands of years and has a fascinating history up until even about 100 years ago. Things with the language completely changed and were updated to fit the modern world. So I'm super psyched to be sharing this with you. And I think that it's really a beautiful thing for people to delve into other languages and cultures. And I believe that even if you don't have a personal connection to the language of Hebrew or the religion of Judaism, that doesn't matter at all. The interest in different cultures and different languages, I firmly believe, can help to forge unity and camaraderie in the world in a really real way. That coming together on screen certainly helps to then rebuild that in the real world. So let's all dive right in and understand a little bit about the context of Hebrew and calligraphy. We'll learn about the letter forms, how to recognize them, what they're called, a little bit about the fascinating symbolism behind it, and then we'll learn how to actually create the letter forms. So as I mentioned, I live in Israel. I live in a little town off of the Mediterranean Sea. And what's fascinating about it is that it's a modern place with all the amenities that you might imagine in a first world country. But if you just veer out to the outskirts by the sea, there's an ancient city that was built thousands of years ago by Herod the Great. And it was rebuilt by the Crusaders and so on and so forth. So I think it's really cool that this is a modern city, but it wears its history on its sleeve. And I'm opening with this because I think that Hebrew is sort of the same. It has this fascinating contrast between its ancient and modern roots. They really come together and they're really obvious. Hebrew today has been modernized so that we can, say things like, is the Wi-Fi working? But the letter forms and the way that the letters are created in many ways are extremely reminiscent to the earliest archaeological Hebrew documents ever found, which are literally thousands of years old. So I think that it's a really fascinating segue into actually learning the letter forms and adding a little bit of meaning. There's even really deep spiritual understandings of the Hebrew letters themselves. Each one can symbolize different Kabbalistic concepts. Each one has numerical value. And of course, there's an infinite amount of beautiful Hebrew calligraphy styles that can be adapted to the general structure that we're going to learn today. So I'm so excited to share this with you. And that's really little bit of the incredible history and context of this language. And on the worksheets, I will have some recommendations for you on books that you can read in order to dive in further. But we'll save it for now for those who are less historically inclined. And now we'll move into a little bit about broad edge calligraphy, which is how Hebrew calligraphy is created, and the tools for working with it, and how we'll actually make the calligraphy itself. So Hebrew calligraphy is created with a broad edge tool. For those who already have experience with broad edge calligraphy, you may want to skip ahead a little bit because I'll just be giving an intro as to how this differs from pointed pen calligraphy and how to set up guides. So for anyone who's not already familiar, broad edge calligraphy basically is using a tool with a chisel top or straight edge in order to create your letter forms rather than a pointed pen that works off of pressure. This works off of angle changes in order to go from a thick to a thin line. So it's very familiar once you give it a try. It's still calligraphy, but it is a little bit of a different tool, so I know that can be intimidating at first. This is the Parallel Pilot pen. It's my absolute favorite. I love how large this chisel top is. This is the 6mm, which I recommend for anybody who is just starting out with broad edge calligraphy or with Hebrew. It's really good to work with a larger size so that you can see what you're doing properly. And when you're working with a smaller tool, often what comes in those like calligraphy kits from art stores, they'll have a little fountain pen with this tiny little chisel top. And I think that it's not great to start with those because they're so small, you'll have a hard time understanding when something goes wrong. With this, it's so large that it'll be clear to you what could be improved upon, okay? So for those who don't already have one of these, essentially the way it works is that you open up the package and you insert one of the cartridges. You just screw open this part and you stick it right in there. There's one edge over here that has the clear plastic, and you just very delicately stick that inside until you feel that it has a bit of impact. You can even squeeze it the tiniest bit to help the ink go forward towards the nib, and then you just close it tightly and you'll have the most wonderfully flowing ink. It does dirty your hands and leak out, so I warn you not to do this on the day you have a photo shoot, or don't wear clothes that are precious, and perhaps protect the surface that you're working on. But the ink flows so smoothly and nicely, and you don't really need special paper for this tool. You can even work off of printer paper when you print out these worksheets. So I think that for the most part, it's great for learning with. When I'm doing actual projects and I want to use the parallel pen, I will switch out the ink. You can manually refill this as long as it's not with waterproof ink, which would clog the nib. Or you can just dip it directly into the ink that you'd like to use, which I've been doing lately. This metal nib creates such beautifully sharp lines that it's just one of my favorites, as I said. Now, as for broad edge guide creation, what we have here are called nib widths. Nib widths are essentially these tiny little measurements, which is the width of the pen that you're using, right? If I were using a broad edge pen that was much narrower than my nib width, which is just the smallest little finger movement, it would be smaller than this one. This is quite large, so it creates nib widths this size, okay? And this helps to determine the X height of the letter forms that we'll be creating, right? Scribes traditionally decided upon a certain X height for a traditional style. For whatever reason, they felt that that was the most beautiful or the most useful or legible. And so what we're learning today, the nib width is about 3.5. So here what I've created are 1, 2, 3, and then another half a nib width in order to set up my guides, my baseline, and my waistline. Okay, so this is really important, especially when you're learning a brand new language, new letter forms that don't necessarily mean anything to you yet and you don't recognize them. It's not a great idea to freehand it because you don't yet have the eye to understand, wait, if I elongate this letter, does it really matter? Does it start looking like another letter? And in Hebrew, specifically, there are many letter forms that can be mistaken for one another if you just warp the sizing a little bit. So I just want to emphasize the importance of guides. If you have any background in calligraphy, that won't be news to you, that the guides are really important to set up and for gaining just good practice, okay? Now, historically, Hebrew, it is, the letters hang off of the top guide, and there wasn't usually a baseline, but I'm going to create it for you anyway. And of course, Hebrew is written from right to left, which may be new for a lot of people. Of course, Arabic calligraphy also works that way, but it's a little new, and obviously most people are righties, so this can become sort of a hassle because you're writing from here, and with the right hand, your hand may seem to cover the letters that you're about to create. That can be frustrating. There isn't any one solution. A lot of people end up turning their page a little bit to help them see a little more clearly. You'll have to see what works for you. I have a little bit of an advantage as a lefty. I don't smudge the ink as I'm moving forward as a righty might, right? Because your hand is leaning over the paper. And yeah, well, we're only 10% of the population. So to all you lefties out there, you're in luck. One last step before actually creating the letter forms with our own hands is looking at the letter forms, recognizing them, knowing their names, and how to pronounce them. I don't expect anyone to come out of here reading Hebrew all of a sudden if you don't have a background, but I love to give as much context as possible within this short class so that it's more than just a couple of random shapes to you. And perhaps you could even put together a short word in the end, and I'll give you a whole bunch of examples in the worksheets. All right, so there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, and some of the characters have special forms when that letter is at the end of a word. So altogether, there are 27, but we're going to focus on the 22 for today because that's more than enough. Okay, this is Aleph, then moving on to the second letter, Bet, Gimel, Daled, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yud, Chaf. This is the Chaf at the end of a word, so you don't really have to focus on this one. Moving on, Lamed, Mem, Nun. Again, this is the Nun that comes at the end of a word. Samech, Ain, Pei. Once more, this is the Pei that comes at the end of a word. Tzadik, and this too, this would be a word that has tzadik at the end. It would look like this instead of this. Kuf, Resh, Shin, Taf. Now this is the Israeli pronunciation of the Hebrew letters, of course with my American accent. In the worksheets, you'll find very clearly stated the shape of each letter form and its name. Now I'm beginning to write, and as you'll see, I am opening the new Pilot Parallel pen. I'm inserting the cartridge, I'm squeezing it a little bit so that the ink flows into the ink barrel, and then I'm closing it up again, making sure it's closed tightly, and preparing my guides. So as we discussed, I'm going to make my nib widths here. Here you'll see that I was having a little bit of trouble with the ink flow because it's a brand new pen and the barrel is still not fully ready to go. So all I do is take a piece of scrap paper and I kind of run the nib back and forth until I see ink flowing smoothly. And that's when I know that it's a good time to actually start. If you find that you're trying to make your nib widths or any line and the ink isn't flowing wholly and your line looks like there's ink missing, it just means that you're not making a full confident mark on the page and you need to hold the pen a little bit more parallel with the paper to get proper ink flow. This takes practice, and again, this is a new tool probably for a lot of you, and the nib is really large, so it's an unusual size to work with, but I assure you it's going to be worth it. So here I made the nib widths, and then I make pencil markings on either side in order to create that baseline and waistline. And here I'm showing you that with this pen and this Rhodia notebook that I'm using, the dot pad, which is definitely not a necessity, but I love it for practice. The distance from two dots to one another is about the width of my nib with a 6mm pilot parallel pen. So this is what I'm demonstrating here, and I made a little square shape that runs from the X height through the whole X height because the Hebrew letter forms are based on the square shape. So you'll notice throughout that I'm creating all the letter forms within this penciled in square area, and that helps to keep track of the general form of the square that all of the Hebrew letters are based around. So this will help you keep proportions. It's a great way to practice, and you'll find it in the worksheets as well. Now I'm creating an aleph. The aleph is composed of a center diagonal line, which runs from the top left of our penciled in area that we created. It goes from the top left to the bottom right at about 60 degrees. And then we come in and create an upper arm from the top right, extending from our 60 degrees and then twisting our hand a bit to run back towards the center of that diagonal line. And you notice that one the thickest line to a very thin line. And this contributes to the beauty and calligraphic look of this form of writing with those extreme contrasts between thicks and thins. Then we create that second leg on the bottom left that also extends from the center and goes full width downward and then curving back inside the aleph towards the center. Next, we move on to the letter bet, which you will see the form of it, its roots will reappear over and over throughout the Hebrew alphabet, which is also called the aleph bet, by the way. The bet is created with two strokes, starting at the top left edge of our square and going along in one swift stroke and then curving downwards and releasing before the end, just when one bottom tip of the nib reaches the bottom of our square. We don't go all the way down. And then we release and come with the second stroke, which starts from the bottom left along the baseline, and at the same angle throughout, we extend to the right and just stick out of our pencil shape that we created so that there's this little foot stepping out, and this is bet. Now we are on to letter Gimel, the third letter in the alphabet, or aleph bet. And I created two versions because I wasn't really satisfied with the first one. You'll see here that our Gimel doesn't really fill in our square the same way that the aleph and bet does. It has a short roof that starts from the top left and then curves into a diagonal that meets at the floor by our baseline. And then we come in with our second stroke, which is a very short leg that is, again, the same angle, about 60 degrees. It's about a nib width wide. And then we have the thinnest connection between that leg and the central diagonal stem of the Gimel. And now for the Daled, we have two strokes. Once again, we use our 60-degree roof stroke where we begin from the top left of our penciled in square and we go to the right until we reach the edge of the square, and then onto the second stroke, which is a little bit of a protruding point. You start from the top just above our waistline and then extend downward and meet the baseline with the tip of our nib. Next, we have the letter Hey, which has the familiar roof and right leg like the bet, but this time it has a very short upright leg that doesn't connect to the top half. So the hay has this left short leg that is, again, at 60 degrees, a vertical line that is sort of hanging in midair. Next, we have the letter Vav, which again, you can see is a portion of the bet shape. We start all the way at the right of our penciled in square. We have a very short roof before we begin descending, still at about 60 degrees. We're descending into our horizontal until we're gently meeting our baseline. Next, we have the letter Zayin, which has a short roof at our usual angle, and then we have a diagonal vertical coming downward and meeting at a point. This is in contrast to the Vav, which has a straight leg coming downward. The Zayin is a bit at a diagonal. Next up is the letter Chet, which has the usual roof that extends from one end of our penciled square to the other and descends immediately into a vertical coming down and meeting the baseline with a point. And then it has a left arm, so we return back to the top by our waistline, and at 60 degrees we come down in a straight line. Next is the letter Tet. Tet begins with the letter Vav on its left, and it extends a little bit outside of our penciled box. Not all the letters fit in perfectly. So we are beginning our short roof of the Vav shape a little bit outside of our penciled square, and then we are creating a new sort of movement coming up from the baseline about a fourth of the way, and then we return to our waistline and at our usual 60 degrees, coming downward, and at a bit of a diagonal, we're now meeting with that second stroke. So the Tet has 3 strokes. Next up is the letter Yud, which got cut off when I was creating it, but luckily it's the smallest letter in the alphabet, and all it is a very short roof that extends from the very right edge of our pencil square from the waistline, and it just dips down about 1 nib width. This is the letter Chaf, which has the shape we've seen many times before, starting with our roof from the left to the right of our penciled in waistline area, turning down into a vertical immediately, and then with our second stroke, which is basically almost a letter Bet, but we don't extend out of our penciled in area, so we don't have that extra extending foot. This one meets the horizontal that was coming down and releases. Next up is the letter Lamed, which is the only ascender in the Hebrew alphabet. This one is a little bit more complicated with a couple of steps. I like to begin it with our typical shape that we've seen before, which you'll see very soon. That shape, when it stands on its own, is called a resh, but basically it is that horizontal line that extends from our waistline within the penciled square area from the right to the left, extending not all the way this time to the baseline, but halfway. And then we have our second stroke coming from the bottom up, like we saw in the letter Tet, connecting that with our first stroke that we'd made. And now we come from the top, from outside of our penciled in area, from above the waistline, and we're creating sort of a truncated letter Vav, or almost a Yud, that connects, and this together creates the Lamed. Next is the letter Mem, which also extends a little bit from our penciled in border. We're creating that Vav shape with a short roof, and then extending still at the same angle, but horizontal now, meeting gently with our baseline, and then we're coming up and creating a new roof extending from
the right edge of our vav shape to the edge of our penciled in area and coming down into a vertical. And then we have a third stroke, which doesn't touch that vav shape on the left. We leave about a nib width's worth between, and then we make a short foot on the baseline that connects with our second stroke. Next up is the letter Nun, which doesn't fill up the entire area of our penciled square. You can make it alongside the right border of the penciled area. It's a short roof which extends downward and then has a short foot in addition. Next we have Samech, which is a rounded letter form. It has that usual roof that goes from the whole width of our penciled in area from left to right, coming down to the middle of our X height. And then we have a second stroke that meets on the top left and it curves around. This may take some practice because we haven't really made this shape before. We're going in a circular motion and meeting up with the bottom of our first stroke. Next, we have the letter Ayin, which is a difficult one and has several strokes. I essentially begin with a little yud shape in the top right, that smallest letter of the alphabet, and then I come from the bottom by the baseline at our usual 60 degrees at a diagonal though, and coming and meeting with that yud, and then I go left in order to create another stroke that is more similar to a vav, and that one extends down from the waistline to the baseline and connects with our second stroke. Next up, we have the letter Pei, which has that roof that extends the whole width of the area within our penciled square from the left to the right, extending down, meeting the baseline, and then it has the foot that also, like the letter Chaf, comes from the left to the right, touching the edge of our first stroke. And now we have a new movement, a new sort of stroke that comes from just a tad inside of our square. We're not starting at the edge, we're moving in just a little bit, and then we are extending down from our waistline and creating a downward and then movement to the right, a nib width's worth, and then releasing. This creates the sort of nose of the Pei. Next we have the letter Tzadik, which is also a bit of a difficult one, although it's my favorite. We are starting from the top left of our square, and we are making a short roof of about 1 nib width before we descend into a diagonal that meets with the bottom right corner of our square. And the next step is to go along our baseline with our usual 60-degree angle before we come back up and create our right arm, descending at a bit of a diagonal from our right area, from the waistline, and then meeting a fourth of the way down on that original diagonal. Next, we have the letter Kuf, which has the roof that extends the whole length of our square, but it releases earlier than usual, about 1/4 of the way down the vertical. And then we have the second stroke that we've seen from the Lamed. It starts at the baseline and it goes upward to meet the end of the first stroke. And then we have, similar to the Hey, this sort of hanging foot, except that this extends further down. So we're leaving a little bit of space in between that first stroke on the left, and we're leaving that room and then creating a vertical coming downward and dipping below the baseline. This is one of the only descending letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Next, we finally have the letter Resh, which we have seen in many other letter forms throughout, in the Bet, in the Hey, in the Chaf, and so many more. The Resh is their root. Next we have the letter shin, which I think is really beautiful. It extends outside of our penciled area. Begin by making that Vav shape all the way on the left with a short roof, but quickly going into a bit of a diagonal, and then creating the second stroke from the baseline up, as we've seen before with the ayin, and then we go back up to the waistline in the top right of our square, and we are curving down in order to meet with that second stroke with a nice thin overlap. And the last step for the letter Shin is to create an internal arm, a third arm, if you will, that goes in between that area that's left along our waistline, and we create a similar shape to that right arm. And we just connect with that middle original diagonal. And now for our very last letter, Taf. This has the Resh as its base, and then we come down similar to the Chet, coming from a 60-degree angle on the left side, coming down from our waistline, stopping just before the baseline, and then extending out for a perfectly horizontal line to create that foot of the Taf. Now I'm demonstrating for you how I am creating the word shalom, which means hello and peace. And I wanted to just show you in terms of word formation. It's a little bit more advanced, obviously, but the same principles apply here as they do in other languages and other forms of calligraphy, where we want to keep an eye on optical accuracy. It's not something that should be done in a robotic way. It is usually determined through practice and through recognition of Hebrew texts. So my trick, especially for those who don't already have experience in Hebrew, is to, practice a word based off of what I have in the worksheet or something you found online, and then turn your work upside down so that you really don't recognize the shapes that you're looking at. You're just looking at the word as shapes on their own. And this way, we're better able to determine if there's an area that is very white, and so there's too much white space, or an area that looks like it just has a lot going on, so maybe that the letters there are too congested. And here I wanted to just demonstrate for you how versatile this Pilot Parallel pen is. It also allows you to get these really gorgeous thin lines that you can use for flourishing by putting pressure only on the very edge of the nib and then dragging it along the paper. You can create decorative flourishes off of these letter forms, even though unlike in English, where sometimes the flourishes have a utility and are part of an ascender or descender, in Hebrew we don't have many ascenders and descenders, so I think it's okay to feel free to play with these flourishes that are purely decorative, as long as they have enough of a contrast in thickness to the actual word, and this way they don't get in the way of legibility and they're clearly just for fun and a means of expression. And similarly, Hebrew has vowels or diacritic marks. There are these little dots that I made here, and they are also a wonderful means of adding character to your letter forms. And here, using the Pilot Parallel pen, we get these beautiful diamond shapes in order to meet these vowel markings. I've heard some people say that Hebrew calligraphy is very boxy, and so they feel sort of stifled and that it's not expressive. But I really don't feel that way because of the incredible ability to bring versatility to Hebrew calligraphy with different tools. There are all sorts of broad edge tools, and there are lots of different styles that have developed through the millennia. And I simply don't feel a lack of expression, although I understand that from the outside, in comparison to pointed pen calligraphy with all the loops and all the different, very different styles, it can seem like, gosh, all these letters, they're so, they stand alone, and how do I make them flow, and where's the harmony? But I see a beauty in it that I really hope you will also. There's a rhythm, there's balance, and there's room for playing with it.
Together, we learned the foundational Hebrew script, and I just want to quickly flip through the examples of scripts in this fascinating book by Ada Yardeni to give you the quickest context as to how these letter forms are still recognizable through time. Once you learn the basics and learn to look a little bit, you'll recognize there's an olive here, and a bet, and a gimel, and a dalet. It's coming from a clear source, and this is from 3rd century BCE, okay? And this is all chronological, 2nd century CE, okay? Moving forward to the time of Herod, where things really become clearer, and you don't have to strain quite as much to find the roots of the letters that you know well once you learn modern Hebrew. So I think it's really cool thing that you could, take your knowledge of the Hebrew letter forms, and if you develop it, you can move back in time and read primary sources from the time of the Bible and read about all these incredible events that happen with just a little bit of, an understanding of the skeletal structure of the Hebrew letter forms. And just look how much amazing variation there has been over time. It never ceases to amaze me. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining in on this short introduction to Hebrew calligraphy. I'm so thrilled that you came along and took an interest in this craft that's so close to my heart. If you'd like to learn more, keep an eye out on my Instagram. I offer Hebrew calligraphy workshops from time to time, and I do plan to have more this summer. I also sell Hebrew calligraphy kits, which are full of various tools that are all good for Hebrew calligraphy and experimentation, using even traditional tools such as vellum, which the Torah scroll is written on. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you to Peggy for organizing the incredibly valuable summer creative retreat, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your summer.